The prairie lay stretched under the wide sweep of night, silvered by the light of the moon. Jeb Walker had just come in from tending his cattle, his body aching with the familiar pull of labor. His hands were raw from barbed wire, his shoulders burned from the weight of his saddle, and his eyes felt heavy as stones. He slumped into the chair by the fire, kicked off his boots, and let the silence of the plains settle around him. Silence had been his constant companion for years. He was a cowboy who owned little more than his mule, a few head of cattle, and this cabin pieced together with sweat and stubborn will. Folks in town called him unlucky, cursed, or simply pitiful. To Jeb, he was just tired. He had been half asleep when the knock came. A strange sound, so soft it almost blended with the groan of the wind. Jeb straightened, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. Out here, you didn't take chances with strangers after dark. He padded barefoot to the door and pulled it open. The sight that met him stopped his heart cold. Two figures stood together in the glow of the moonlight, two young women wrapped in worn shawls, their dark hair shining like ink in the silver light. Their eyes were large, glimmering with both fear and defiance, and their posture told him they were ready to run if he made the wrong move. For a moment, Jeb thought he was dreaming, but the way the elder sister's chin lifted, steady and unyielding, told him otherwise. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice rough from sleep. The younger sister glanced nervously at her sibling, and it was the older one who answered. "The men, from town. They said you would." She hesitated, her English marked with careful precision. "They said you would keep us. Or laugh." Jeb's jaw tightened. The cruel, familiar laughter of the townsfolk echoed in his memory. He could picture them, half drunk in the saloon, making wagers and shoving the sisters toward his cabin. It was a joke, nothing more to them, dumping two Apache women on the doorstep of a lonely cowboy too poor to court a wife. To them, it was another story to sneer about, another reason to mock his solitude. But looking at the sisters, Jeb felt the heat of shame rise inside him, not for himself, but for them. They weren't a joke. They were flesh and blood, proud and unbroken despite the fear in their eyes. "You hungry?" Jeb asked after a long silence. His voice was softer now, though his chest still burned with anger at the men who had brought them here. The younger sister hesitated, her lips trembling, before she gave the smallest nod. The older one narrowed her eyes, wary of him, but her sister's hunger outweighed her suspicion. Jeb stepped back from the door, opening it wider. "Come in, then. Night's cold." Inside, the cabin was small, one bed, one table, a single chair by the fire. It wasn't much of a home, but it was warm, and it was safe. The sisters moved cautiously, clutching their shawls, their eyes darting around the room. They were prepared for ridicule, maybe even harm. Instead, Jeb went to the hearth and poured the last of his beans into the pot, adding water, coaxing the fire to life. "Not much," he admitted, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "But it'll fill your bellies." The smell of food soon drifted through the cabin, and he set out bowls on the table. The sisters exchanged a look before they sat, side by side, their movements graceful and careful, like deer unsure if the hunter's rifle was raised. Jeb sat across from them, his own hunger forgotten as he watched them eat in silence. Every so often, the younger one's lips would twitch into a faint smile when she tasted the beans, as though it had been days since she'd eaten a hot meal. "What are your names?" Jeb asked quietly. The older sister looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Nayeli." She tilted her head slightly toward the girl beside her. "Ayanna." Jeb nodded. "I'm Jeb, Jeb Walker." After that, little was said. The sisters ate until the bowls were scraped clean, and Jeb leaned back in his chair, his rifle resting against the wall within reach but forgotten. His thoughts turned bitter as the night wore on. He could imagine the men in town laughing, picturing him in this cabin with two women thrust upon him as though he were desperate enough to take them as toys or servants. But as the firelight flickered over their faces, Jeb saw the truth. These weren't playthings. These were women cast out from their people, abandoned by the townsfolk, tossed to him as though their lives held no worth. He watched Nayeli, her sharp gaze never quite softening, even when fatigue pressed on her shoulders. He watched Ayanna, her head resting lightly against her sister's arm, her youthful features marred by exhaustion. When they finally curled together on the floor by the fire, Jeb fetched an extra blanket from the foot of his bed and draped it over them without a word. They didn't stir, though he noticed Nayeli's eyes open for a brief second, watching him, measuring him. She said nothing. Jeb sat back in his chair, staring at the low flames. The silence pressed around him again, but it wasn't the same silence he had lived with before. This one carried the soft sound of two women breathing, the occasional rustle of the blanket, the reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. He leaned forward, rubbing his hands together. The cruelty of the town folk cut at him, but beneath it stirred something else, a fierce, unspoken vow. Whatever reason had brought these sisters here, they weren't a joke. Not to him, not in this cabin, not a joke, he whispered to himself, the words nearly lost to the crackle of the fire. Not to me. He stayed awake most of the night, listening to the wind outside and the gentle rhythm of their rest. For the first time in years, Jeb Walker felt that his cabin was more than wood and nails. It was a shelter, a place where he wasn't entirely forgotten by the world. And though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he knew one thing with certainty: he would not let the sisters be discarded again. The sun rose slow across the prairie, staining the horizon with bands of orange and gold. Jeb was already awake, tending the fire, his boots pulled back on, the weariness of yesterday lingering in his bones. He had spent most of the night staring into the flames, listening to the soft breaths of the two sisters who had been dropped into his life like a storm without warning. He half expected them to be gone when he turned, vanished into the plains with the dawn. But when he looked over, they were still there, curled together on the blanket, hair tumbling loose, their features softened in sleep. It struck him strange, how easily they seemed to belong in the silence of his cabin, like they had always been meant to rest there. He busied himself with the morning chores, stepping out into the chill air to fetch water from the creek and check the cattle. The herd was restless, their lowing carrying across the open land. As he worked, his thoughts circled back to the sisters. The men in town would be talking about it by now, spinning tales over mugs of cheap whiskey, laughing about the lonely cowboy with two Indian women in his house. Jeb clenched his fists at the thought. He knew their cruelty had no bounds, but he would not let it define him, or the women who had been pushed onto him as a joke. When he returned, he found Nayeli standing near the hearth, her sister still asleep beneath the blanket. She hadn't touched anything, only stood with arms crossed, her sharp gaze following him as though weighing every step he took. "You don't have to be afraid," Jeb said, setting the bucket of water on the counter. "I am not afraid," she answered, her voice steady. There was pride in her bearing, a strength that reminded him of the wild horses he sometimes saw running across the open land, untamed, impossible to break. "Good," he muttered, cracking a few eggs into the pan. "'Cause I don't mean you harm." The smell of frying eggs filled the cabin, and soon Ayanna stirred, stretching with a small sigh before sitting up. She smiled faintly when Jeb slid a plate toward her, though Nayeli remained watchful, barely tasting the food. Jeb didn't press. He understood trust was something earned, not given. The morning passed with a quiet rhythm. Jeb worked outside, fixing a broken section of fence, while the sisters remained near the cabin. From the corner of his eye, he could see Ayanna gathering wildflowers, her laughter soft as she wove them together, while Nayeli stood nearby, always alert, always guarding. He respected it. She had taken it upon herself to shield her sister from every threat, even him. When midday came, he sat on the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. The sisters lingered a few yards away, speaking softly in their own tongue, the words lilting and unfamiliar but filled with a music that stirred something deep inside him. It had been years since Jeb had heard a woman's laughter, and though it was quiet and fleeting, it struck him harder than a gunshot. Later, as the sun dipped low, they shared another meal inside the cabin. Ayanna seemed lighter now, less wary, while Nayeli still held herself like a drawn bowstring. Jeb found his eyes lingering on them, not in hunger or claim, but in quiet wonder. He wondered how they had survived to this point, what hardships had carved that steel into Nayeli's gaze, what hopes flickered in Ayanna's shy smiles. When the meal was done, Jeb leaned back, his voice rough but honest. "I don't know why they sent you here. But I know this, you're not a jest to me. You're not something to laugh about. You're people, and you'll be treated as such while you're under my roof." The sisters exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Ayanna's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but it was Nayeli who finally answered. "You say this now, but men change." "Maybe," Jeb admitted, his eyes steady on hers. "But I'm not most men." Silence fell, heavy and fragile. Jeb didn't push further. He simply stood, fetched another blanket, and spread it across the floor beside theirs. "Tomorrow, I'll see about getting more supplies. For all of us." That night, as the fire dimmed, Jeb lay awake again, though this time he stretched out on the floor a few feet from where the sisters slept. He listened to the soft rhythm of their breathing, to the crackle of the last embers, and somewhere between thought and dream, he felt the edges of his solitude begin to crumble. When dawn came again, something had shifted. Ayanna greeted him with a shy smile as she braided her hair, and even Naeli, though still cautious, didn't watch him with the same unyielding suspicion. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. The days passed like that, each one weaving the three of them closer in ways none of them had expected. Jeb taught Ayanna how to ride one of his horses, her laughter echoing across the field, while Naeli stood by, arms crossed, pretending not to be amused though her eyes softened at her sister's joy. He shared with them the work of the ranch, and in turn, they shared skills of their own, herbs that eased pain, ways to mend torn clothing with quiet precision. What had begun as a cruel joke from the town had turned into something else entirely. Jeb no longer thought of them as intruders or burdens. They were companions, voices in the silence, proof that his life didn't have to be lived in endless solitude. And though no vows had been spoken, no words declared, the bond forming between them was stronger than anything the men in town could sneer at. One night, as he sat by the fire with them, his head heavy with exhaustion, Jeb dozed. In his half-sleep, he murmured words he didn't even realize had slipped past his lips. My wives, the words carried the weight of both longing and belonging, of a man who had never expected to share his life with anyone, now bound in heart to two souls who had been given to him not by choice, but by fate. When he startled awake, embarrassed, he found Ayanna's eyes wide with wonder, and Naeli's expression unreadable. But she did not rebuke him. Instead, she looked at her sister, then at Jeb, and though no word was spoken, something deep and unspoken shifted between them all. From that night forward, the cruel joke of the town no longer mattered. What the men had meant for mockery had become a truth none of them could deny. In the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by the vast and untamed prairie, the cowboy and the two sisters had found something greater than the world's scorn. They had found a home, and in their own way, a family.